Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. Welcome to this session of Meezan lecture series. This series, as you all know, is basically based on Ustaz Ghamidi's Meezan, which is a book that reflects his understanding of the Quran, of Islam and its contents. And we have been studying various chapters of this book since the last many sessions. I presume this is the 34th session, and we have completed a major part of the Sharia. And through the last few sessions, we were actually talking about one of the preambles of this book, which relates to the fundamental principles, in fact. And these fundamental principles actually outline the sources of religion and how we understand these sources. So we had started to cover these sources. It's the source of the Quran, and the Quran is the source itself, and the principles of understanding the Quran were being discussed. So we were discussing the fourth principle, which relates to the final authority of the Quran. We've already finished the principles that relate to language, which in order are appreciation of classical Arabic, eloquence of language, and uniqueness of style. And now we have the one that we're discussing relates to the final authority, which means that the Quran holds final authority, and there seem to be certain issues that undermine this concept. And Ustaz Ghamidi was actually replying and presenting his observations on these concepts, like the concepts of variant reading, the concept of muhkam and mutashabih, and the concept of the intentionality of the text. So we had covered these three, and we had started to cover the fourth one, which is that there seem to be certain ahadiths which challenge this, or presumably challenge the final authority of the Quran, and it does seem that they either modify the meaning of the Quran or they actually abrogate it. And we had covered two such major ahadiths, and both these ahadiths, of course, have a very important place and significance in our Islamic jurisprudence. So the first of them, it actually related to the fact that as far as certain ahadiths are concerned, it seems that the Prophet also is prohibiting certain edibles besides the Quran. And we had seen how the fact that how the Prophet actually mentioned those edibles was not something that he was adding to the list. He was only explaining what is already mentioned in the Quran, and that Quran, of course, tells us that our own fitra, our own nature, is averse to certain things. So he was explaining or delineating that the nature of that fitra, and how the Prophet was just stating what is already found in our nature. And then we also discussed that one of them related to the fact that the Prophet allegedly or supposedly is actually once again adding to the list of the muharramat or prohibited relations, which is mentioned by the Quran, by saying that the aunt and her niece cannot be combined in marriage, and we don't find this to be in the Quran. So we saw how the Quran also actually, although it does not directly mention it, but it is suppressed in one of its verses, the same understanding. And we have also seen how the relationship of fosterage, the way it has been mentioned in the Quran, it has been extended by the Prophet in the narrative, and when that extension is understood in its context, it does not add anything in the Quran by saying that all relationships which are prohibited through lineage are also prohibited to fosterage. That the foster relationships which are prohibited, they're not something which the Prophet is adding. He is just actually extending what is already found in the Quran. So now, on this third example that we're going to study, it is based on another narrative, or it can be regarded as two narratives, in which it seemingly says they seemingly say that they alter the shares of inheritance, or at least they give a certain specification. And the specification is that there is a narrative which says that Muslims cannot inherit from disbelievers, and similarly we have a narrative which is similarly said that as far as these shares are concerned, they have a very uh, specific purport, and no one can deprive an heir of his share or her share. But we do find the Prophet actually doing something different. On certain occasions, he did deprive a certain heir of his share of from the deceased. So is this an abrogation, or is this a specification, or what exactly is this? So this is our third instance in which we will study that how hadith literature or in particular this hadith, seems to actually mention this specification or abrogation, but in fact it is something which is not, and it is something which is found from within the Quran as well. So verses 11 and 12 of Surah Nisa, which mention the distribution of inheritance of a deceased, they say that the reason for this, this proportions, the reason for the shares to be divided into certain proportions is one, and that is the benefit of kinship which a person or an heir has for the deceased. So the Quran has very amply stated this, that as far as the shares are concerned, they must be understood. And these words that you can see from the Quran is, these are this is verse 11 from Surah Nisa. It says, "Aba'ukum wa abna'ukum la tadruna ayyuhum aqrabu lakum naf'a faridatan min Allah inna Allah kana aliman hakima." You know not who among your children and parents are nearest to you in benefit. This is the law of God. Indeed, God is wise and all-knowing. So basically, if you can see the Arabic words, ayyuhum akrabu lakum naf'a, that the reason that the Almighty has outlined these shares in the Quran, it's not based on any haphazard reasoning. It has based on a very definitive reasoning, and that is the benefit which a potential benefit which an heir has for the deceased. And God says that as human beings, we are in no way to discover that potential benefit. So therefore, it is God Almighty who has guided us. And the words are faridatan min Allah, that this is like a law of God. Indeed, God is wise and all-knowing. So you could not have distributed this inheritance according to this benefit of kinship. It is God Almighty who has helped human beings by guiding them in this regard. Now, this benefit is present by nature in parents and children, brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, and all close relations. So, in normal circumstances, they will be considered the heirs to the legacy of a deceased. But of course, there could be certain unusual circumstances in which we can find out, or we diagnose that there is an absence of this benefit found in any of these relations. And this is something that sense and reason can easily diagnose. And if we find that this benefit is not found, then such a person should not become an heir to the deceased legacy, because that benefit, which was the reason for him becoming the heir, is no longer found. So this exception, we can see, has not created a new narrative from the Prophet. He is only stating the obvious. So it was present, this exception was present in the directive from the very inception of the directive. So if a scholar of the Quran refers to it, he would not be changing or altering the meaning of the divine book. He would be perfectly doing something which is in accordance with the understanding of the verse to which its words so clearly testify. So in view of this, the Prophet is reported to have said about the idolaters of Arabia, the words are, as you can see on the screen, La yarasul muslimul kafira walal kafirul muslim, which means a Muslim cannot be an heir to a kafir, nor a kafir be a Muslim's heir. That cannot happen. So in other words, what is being said here is that after the Quraysh and the people of the book were left with no excuse to deny the truth which had been conclusively communicated to them in its ultimate form, their animosity and their opposition and hostility had become very clear. So the benefit of kinship, this benefit between them and the Muslims, stood completely severed. Hence, they could not inherit from one another. So in other words, if the Prophet has said this, that a Muslim cannot inherit from a non-Muslim and vice versa, of course the word used here is kafir. And the word kafir, as we all know, it is something that is, it's a term of the Quran, which means that someone who has intentionally denied the truth which has been delivered to him by no other personality than a messenger of God himself. So this particular narrative actually relates to the disbelievers of the Prophet's times. And because these disbelievers had denied the truth, so the benefit that a disbeliever would carry for a believer would no longer be there. And hence, when the Prophet said that they should not inherit, then he was not adding something to the Quran or not modifying the Quran. He was just stating the obvious being that as long as that benefit of kinship remains, only then that uh, inheritance should be carried out, because the benefit is the basis of this inheritance. In the absence of any benefit, this should not be the case, that they should mutually inherit, and that is precisely what the Prophet has said. So Ustad Ghamidi says that if the Prophet has stated these words, he in no way is altering the meaning, or we can say specifying or adding something to the Quran by saying that a Muslim cannot inherit from from a kafir and vice versa. He's just stating what is the obvious, of course, being the benefit, which was the basis of this inheritance. If it no longer is there, then of course that deprivation of, depriving an heir of his or her share, is absolutely something which is the purport of the Quran itself. Now we come to the fourth example in this regard, and the fourth example also is a narrative, and as you can see that it is being displayed before you. According to this narrative, our jurists think that this narrative has actually abrogated the Quran and the Quranic punishment of fornication for married adulterers, and it says that this narrative shows that basically the punishment of adultery or fornication, which is mentioned in Surah Nur as 100 lashes, is only for those who are unmarried. As far as married people are concerned who commit this crime, then this narrative has actually specified that this shall not take place. For married people, there is another law which this narrative mentions, and this narrative has actually abrogated the Quranic verse for married adulterers. It is only for the unmarried ones that the Quranic verse is applicable. As far as for the married ones are concerned, the directive is found in this narrative. So it says, "Acquire it from me, acquire it from me, acquire it from me." The Almighty has revealed a way for these women. If in such criminals, the unmarried men will be treated in the same way as unmarried women, and their punishment is 100 stripes and exile. And similarly, married men and married women shall be treated in the same way, and their punishment is 100 stripes and death by stoning. So you can clearly see that there is an addition here, that if married men commit this crime, then they shall be stoned to death, and of course they will be also administered 100 lashes. So this, according to our jurists, is like modifying the Quran. It is actually abrogating the Quran for married adulterers. Now, in order to understand this, we have to once again cast a look at the Quran, because we clearly see and we clearly know that the Prophet himself is not going to go beyond the Quran. He's not going to give an additional directive which is not found in the Quran. So if we look at Surah Maida, verses 33 and 34, we know that the punishment of muharaba is mentioned. And this punishment of muharaba is something that the Quran clearly tells us that if people commit this crime of waging war against God and His Prophet, which is called muharaba, and the way they do it is they spread disorder in the land, then Surah Maida says that there are 4 punishments which are prescribed for criminals who do so. And the first is an yuqattalu, which means killing someone in an exemplary way. And then it says sallabu, that to crucify that person. And وَتُقَطَّعْ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَأَرْجُلُهُمْ مِنْ خِلَافٍ is the third punishment, which means amputating limbs from opposite sides. And the fourth one is أَوْ يُنْفَوْا مِنَ الْأَرْضِ, which means that they could be exiled from their place. So basically, Ustaz Ghamidi says that it is this punishment, or these punishments which are mentioned in Surah Maida, about which the Prophet has explained this narrative. And in his own times, he actually included prostitutes in the application of this directive, and is reported to have said what we have just studied. So these crimes are not ordinary crimes of adultery. They are crimes of prostitutes, and of course they are crimes of spreading nuisance and disorder, which also includes rape. So his view is, Ustaz Ghamidi says, that since such women were not merely guilty of fornication, but also were guilty of spreading anarchy and nuisance in the society, because they had adopted prostitution as a way of life, so those among them who deserved any lenience or mitigation were administered the punishment of 100 lashes, according to the verse of Surah Nur, which says that adulterers have to be punished by 100 lashes. And because and they were exiled according to verse 33 of Surah Maida that we have just studied or just referred to, that if such women who deserved any lenience, then they were administered 100 lashes, and in accordance with this verse of Surah Maida, they were exiled. But other women who did not deserve any lenience in that case, so they did not have, I mean, they could not be treated in any mitigation with any mitigation, then in accordance with this verse of Surah Maida, they would be stoned to death. And of course, the directive of taqtil would be the one that would be administered to them. So once again, we can see that the Prophet has not at all changed the purport of the Quran. He has just made it clear that these are not cases of ordinary adultery. It's not that because of adultery that they are being punished. It is like asking a question whether a person really deserved any mitigation or not. And one of the questions he asked while punishing people of this crime was whether that person was married or not. Of course, that would increase the intensity of the crime. And when something increases the intensity of the crime, then it becomes grave. And that is something which was not properly understood by the jurists, and they think that the basis of reasoning or the basis of administering the stoning punishment was merely because the person was married, and that is of course not the case. The Prophet was just inquiring after the circumstances that if you committed this heinous act, and that too while you were married and you had access to a spouse, then it means that you don't deserve any mitigation or lenience. So in effect, Ustad Ghamidi is saying that we have to understand that it's not that these narrative that I just cited is something that is abrogating the Quranic verse of 100 lashes. It is just telling us that this crime is not an ordinary crime that has been committed. It's a crime that has been committed by individuals who've adopted prostitution, and therefore in such a case, if they deserve any lenience, then they will be administered 100 lashes and exiled. And if they don't, if they are not, in any way deserve any mitigation, then they shall be administered 100 lashes and stoning to death. And we also know that when death punishment is combined with any other punishment, then the other punishment is not carried out because the death punishment is the ultimate punishment. So once again, Ustad Ghamidi has said that if we understand this directive, we can clearly see that there is no case of abrogation or specification by hadith regarding what the Prophet has said. We will now look at another example. This is the fifth example. And in this example also, we will see that the Quran says that, or apparently a hadith says that the meat of dead animals, of course, we know from the Quran that the meat of dead animals should not be consumed. But we do see the Prophet telling us that there are two types of dead animals that can still be consumed. So apparently this is again a direct contradiction, that how can, when the Quran says that the meat of dead animals cannot be consumed, but the Prophet says that there are two types of dead animals that can be consumed. And if you look at the narrative, it says, "Uhillat lana maytatan wa daman al-jarad wal haytan wal kabid wal tahal," which means two types of dead and two forms of blood are not forbidden for us. The former being fish and locust, and the latter being liver and spleen. So we find that the Prophet allegedly or presumably or apparently is altering the purport of the Quran. He's saying, when the Quran says that no, you cannot eat a dead animal, the meat of a dead animal. But here the Prophet is reported to have said that two types of dead animals, which are fish and locust, they can be eaten. And the Quran also says that we cannot consume blood. Blood is forbidden. But here we find the Prophet saying that there are two types of blood which can be consumed, and that is liver and spleen, because of course they are also blood per se. I mean, it's like blood is running through them. Now, what exactly has happened here? We have to see that a person who is conversant with the linguistic features of Arabic knows that this word maita, has a literal meaning, and it also has a meaning which emanates from its linguistic usage. So you see, we must understand that there is a literal meaning and there is a usage of that word. In the first case, it means everything which is dead. Maita means dead. But in usage, anyone who is aware of the delicacies and intricacies of the Arabic language knows that dead fish and dead locusts never fall linguistically in the usage of maita. So linguistically, It's not that the Prophet was adding something or specifying that locust or dead fish, for example, they are not maita. He was just delineating what the usage of Arabic term is. So when the word maita is used, no Arabic language expert includes dead fish or dead locust in its connotations. So the Prophet was just explaining that, and because this fact was not understood, people thought that, well, perhaps the Prophet is once again altering the Quran. And I'm here going to cite Ustaz Zamakhshari, which Ustaz Ghamidi has actually cited and quoted, and it will make clear how things stand as far as usage and linguistic meaning is concerned. So Zamakhshari says, then if you ask the question, among the dead, there are some things which are allowed to us, like the fish and locust, and the Prophet has said two types of dead and types of, or two forms of blood are allowed to us. I will say in response, the word maita mentioned in the Quran must be understood according to its linguistic usage. Is not the case that when someone says that he has eaten maita, we never include a fish or a locust in its connotation. This is similar to the fact that if a person says that he has drunk blood, we never include a liver or spleen in its connotation. Precisely because of such usage, jurists say that if a person swears that he will never eat meat and then he consumes fish, this will not break his oath, although in reality, as he has eaten meat. So the important distinction, dear viewers, that we have to understand here is that there is a linguistic meaning of something, and then there is a connotation of something as per the usage of that word, and it is always the usage which is adopted and specified by the Quran, and never the literal meaning. In literal meaning, of course, the word maita would include dead fish, because maita means something which is dead. But by usage and the way we use a language, we never at times include certain things, and this is one of the examples that locust, dead locust or dead fish is never called as maita linguistically. Anything else can be called a maita, but except these two. And similarly, blood cannot be consumed, but the spleen, not only the spleen, but we also know that liver, I mean, both of these organs have lots and lots of blood. So if someone consumes these two organs, then it would not be said that he has consumed blood, because as we know that linguistically, these two words, they are not included in blood. So this is what Ustaz Ghamidi has said. Now we come to the sixth and final example regarding the alteration or the abrogation of a Quranic directive by a certain hadith. Let me first point out this directive. This directive is mentioned in Surah Maida. This is verse 38. It says the punishment of theft, and it spells out the punishment of theft as وَالسَّارِقُ وَالسَّارِقَةُ فَاقْطَعُوا أَيْدِيَهُمَا جَزَاءً بِمَا كَسَبَ نَكَالًا مِنَ اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ عَزِيزٌ حَكِيمٌ. And as to a thief, male or female, cut off their hands as a reward of their own deeds and as an exemplary punishment from God, for God is mighty and wise. Now, the hadith which seems to alter this meaning of the Quran, I mean, the Quran says that all types of thieves, apparently it means that all types of thieves would be, their hands must be amputated. This is what it seemingly says, but we find a narrative of the Prophet actually saying something different and specifying if the amount of theft is below a certain amount, or the nature of theft is different from the theft that we can imagine, then hands will not be amputated. So again, the question arises, is the Prophet again altering the meaning of the Quran, or it is something else that we have not understood? So Ustaz Ghamidi once again says that, well, this is again something of a, I mean, it's like a instance in which the purport of the Quranic verse has not been understood. And he says that if you look at these verses, or this verse of Surah Maida actually, it says that a thief, which whether he's a male or a female, his or her hands have to be amputated. And the word which is used to qualify a thief is sariq for the male thief and sariqa for the female thief. So Ustaz Ghamidi says that every scholar of the Arabic language knows that words sariq and sariqa, they are adjectives. They're not verbs, they are adjectives. And adjectives always denote completeness and thoroughness in the characteristics of the verb they qualify. So they can only be used for the type of saraqa, for the type of theft, which can actually be called a theft. And the one who commits that heinous act is called a thief. So if a child steals a few rupees from his father's pocket or his mother's wallet, or if a wife pinches some money from her husband, or if a person steals something very ordinary, or plucks some fruit from his neighbor's orchard, or carries away something valuable which has been left unprotected, I mean, that thing was already unattended, or drives away an unattended grazing animal, or commits this ignoble offense owing to some need or compulsion. I mean, he was very hungry, for example. Then no doubt all these are unworthy acts and can be and should be punished, but they cannot be classified as the acts of theft which the above or the verse that we have studied qualifies. Because in this verse, what is said is that a person is a thief and he has committed this theft in such a way that he deserves no lenience. And why do we say that? Because the word which is used to qualify the person who steals is sariq, and sariq is someone who's a thief personified. I mean, he is really a thief, and any instance of theft which does not qualify in its ultimate sense does not deserve this punishment. So we know that, for example, Caliph Umar, in his own times, he did not administer the punishment of theft for those who had stolen, because there was a severe famine in his times, and there were people who were stealing it under compulsion. I mean, they were not thieves, but because of the fact that there was a famine, there was a drought, so they had to fill their stomachs and they ended up stealing some food. And he said that, well, such people cannot be qualified as thieves, because a thief is a person who commits something in cold blood, in planning in such a way that he cannot deserve any lenience. So if the Prophet is giving concession, he is not actually altering the Quran. He's just stating the obvious, that such acts cannot be qualified as theft. So this narrative that is generally thought to have abrogated the Quran or altered the Quran is in fact not altering the Quran according to Ustaz Ghamidi in any way. It is just explaining that the way these things have occurred, or the way these acts have occurred, they cannot be qualified the theft which the Quran speaks of. So this narrative, as you can see, is found in the Muwatta of Imam Malik. It says, if a fruit is hanging from a tree or a goat is grazing on a mountainside and someone steals them, then hands should not be amputated for this. But if the goat comes in a penfold and the fruit is stacked in a field, then hands should be amputated on the condition that the fruit or the goat are at least the price of a shield. So once again, this narrative might seem on its face value that it is altering the Quran or specifying the Quran, whereas this is not the case, because the word theft must be understood. It has to be applied to individuals who do so under no compulsion, who do so in cold blood, who do so in a way that what they are doing is actually something in which they cannot be given any mitigation, any lenience. And of course, that will also amount to the fact that a minimum amount of theft must be also fixed, because something which is very ordinary cannot be regarded to be an act of theft. So all in all, these are the 6 examples which Ustaz Ghamidi has presented in his book, and said that all these 6 ahadiths which seemingly modify or abrogate the Quran, it's not the correct understanding. It's not the case that they have abrogated or modified the Quran. In fact, they are in perfect harmony with what the Quran has said. It's just a question of not understanding and placing them in the way they should be. So I'm going to end my talk here today, and in our next session, inshallah, we'll continue with the remaining principles of understanding the Quran. But as far as this principle is concerned, this took a couple of sessions to actually cover, but it is one of the most important principles. And if you ask me, I can tell you, most debates that have arisen in our jurisprudence is because of this connection or this relationship between the Quran and Hadith, which if taken through one angle would seem as if our Hadiths are altering or specifying the Quran. But if this is viewed from another angle, you can clearly see that they are not altering the Quran, they are not abrogating the Quran, they are just actually explaining the purport of the Quran. It's just a question of deeply deliberating on them. So, if you have any questions on these 6 narratives, please raise them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. Calling for questions, you can type them in the chat or raise your hand to ask your questions. I think I will start off with a question. Since we talked about locusts specifically, that's an insect. Why is it being compared to animals?
Because this was something that was consumed, and we are not talking about the locusts that you might know. So in Arabs, they were like this big, they were quite big, and they were eaten. So we're not talking about those locusts that we are generally aware of.
Thank you for the clarification. Any more questions? If not, should we take general questions or should we end the session early?
We can take general questions.
All right. If you have any general questions, please raise them. Could you please provide an explanation on kosher food?
So kosher is the Jewish equivalent of halal food, which means that the name of God Almighty has been pronounced at the time of slaughter, and the form of slaughter is that it has been done in a way that all the blood has poured out from the animal's body, and hence it is absolutely halal. So any place that you find kosher meat, it's like eating halal meat. It's the Jewish equivalent of halal meat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. I've also heard that some people say, for example, crabs or lobsters, those aren't halal. Could you please explain that?
So you see, we have to understand the principle. We instead of going through every animal species, because you see, what we know is that if we know the principle, then the application of that principle is the real thing. And in that application, one person can differ from the other. So what is being said here is that animals, which are beasts in their nature, which means that either they have sharp claws through which they tear apart their prey, or they have sharp teeth through which they tear apart their prey, and hence they are carnivorous in nature. So because of the fact that they have this beastliness in them, the savagery in them, and because whatever we eat has an effect on the people who consume it, if you eat the meat of such animals which are savage animals, which are carnivores, then their habits tend to come into those who actually consume them, like for example being very aggressive, very angry, or things that make a person close to resembling a beast. So the reason is that, as I said, that the Quran tells us or wants us to refrain from these such animals, because whatever these animals are, they are bound to reflect their habits on in the people who consume them. So this is the only prohibition, that as far as those animals are concerned which have that carnivorous nature, they should be avoided. So crabs or lobsters or all these things, they have to be viewed one by one, even octopus and all these things, and seen if this principle applies. And the second principle, of course, is that animals which are or regarding which human beings are naturally abhorrent to eat. For example, naturally over a period of very long or a very long period of time, centuries, mankind does not generally consume lizards or tadpoles or the like. So because they're abhorrent to their nature, and the thesis of the Quran is that all animals which are abhorrent to nature, they don't need to be specified, because our nature itself is something that actually gives the verdict. However, it could be slightly different from certain people, because we do know that right in the time of the Prophet, we got an example of that when Khalid bin Walid, anhu, a very famous companion, he actually ate something which is close to a lizard, a big lizard, and the Prophet could not eat it actually. It was served on a meal, and Khalid asked the Prophet that, is this haram? The Prophet said, no, it's not haram, but I don't like it, because of course he was referring to the fact that there are certain animals about whose abhorrence or aversion human beings can have two approaches, and hence there could be some diversity as well. So this is one type of prohibition, and the other type is of carnivorous animals. So if you look at these two things, then you can clearly see or apply this to all sorts of sea animals.
Is the confusion that arises in sea animals because they're not technically tearing apart their prey, but say they're using the clams, they're trying to open their clams.
Right.
And
So, as I said, I mean, when they're tearing apart that prey, it's not essentially from their teeth, it could be from their claws or their clamps. So, either way, because it gives you that impression that you are pouncing over your prey or you're tearing it apart, and hence that beastliness is found in that animal.
thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. Our question asks, if a halal chicken is cooked in the same cooking vessel as a haram food, what would be the ruling on that?
So once again, this is a matter of, I mean, ijtihad and understanding. It all depends on the nature of the utensil. Is it maybe at times they do clean that utensil, at times they change the oil, or at times they don't. So it's just a question of being more cautious. One person could be very cautious and avoid this, and the other person could say, well, we are just, I mean, utensil is not going to change the meat, because I mean, it's not going to have any effect. But another person can argue that there could be small bits and pieces that might have been left over in that utensil and they might get attached. So, I mean, these are two approaches. A very cautious approach would be to avoid it, and a less cautious approach would be that, okay, it's fine. So, I think it should be left to the person's approach. But personally, I think we should be cautious.
So would you apply the same ruling for, say, when you order pizza and you know that you're ordering, say, cheese pizza, but the same slicer is being used for pepperoni pizza in non-Muslim countries?
As I said, I mean, this is a very subtle thing, and it's just a question of the sensitivity of a person. And if you think that if you're using that, I mean, that way, I mean, if you're slicing a particular part, and you think that because the machine is the same, the slicer is the same, and you could get some pieces attached to it, and to be a person who avoids even a small trace of something which is wrong, I think it would be in the fitness of things if it could be avoided.
Thank you very much. The next question asks, can we eat food prepared by non-Muslims? They do not maintain tahara.
That's fine. I mean, tahara is not a condition. I mean, if you're talking about hygiene, of course, that is something that is a health hazard if you don't maintain hygiene. And tahara, if you mean that they have to do wudu or they have to be ceremonially clean, so that's not even a requirement for Muslims.
Thank you very much. There's a question who's asking, who checks Costco? Costco's like a bulk store.
Yeah, I know. So you see, every store, whether it's Costco, whether it's Walmart or any store, they have Sharia compliant things, and they normally display a badge or a label which says so. I mean, it's not. I mean, all over the world, there are specifications which are mentioned on those products, and I think we should believe them and go by what they say.
Thank you very much. Rafia Khwaja, please go ahead.
Assalamualaikum, Dr. Shehzad. You're talking of Costco. I've seen in most places, in other stores, also in America, it clearly says halal, where it is halal. So, but sometimes I find people become so conscious of, oh no, but they just put halal, they've just written it. So you have to somehow believe when somebody says it's halal, then you have to believe it,
Correct.
don't you?
Yes,
But if
that's
you
what I
start
said.
doubting everything, then it becomes
So
a very
you
big
see,
problem.
unless you have a clear proof that they have actually what they have stated, they are going against what they have stated. I mean, that is the only way or reason that we should maybe go against them. Otherwise, we should follow what they say. I mean, why should they lie? And if they lie, then the onus of that lie is on them.
Yeah. And what do you think of kosher food? Because there are a lot of Jewish restaurants where there's
I
kosher
just
food.
I just answered this question that kosher is absolutely halal. It's just the Jewish name of halal food.
Oh, I see. So their way of slaughtering is just like what we people do. So it's perfectly
Correct.
okay. Thank you
Yes.
so much. Thanks a lot.
Inshallah, we'll see y'all again tomorrow in another session of textual study of the Qur'an. Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem, for another very enlightening session. And thanks to all the participants for coming through. Inshallah, we'll see you all tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.